Meet Carlos and Rachel, both 32, both earning $100,000 a year in the same city, and after years of the specific kind of frugality that turns a gas station hot dog into an acceptable dinner and a car with 210,000 miles into a badge of honor, they've each managed to save $100,000. Same income, same savings, same starting line. But hand them that $100,000 and ask what they'd actually do with it, and they go in completely different directions. Carlos wants leverage working for him. He grew up watching his uncle collect rent checks on a duplex and quietly build more wealth than anyone else in the family, and he wants that for himself. An asset he can drive past, point at, and say, I own part of that. He doesn't mind a Saturday spent fixing a leaking faucet if it means someone else's rent check is paying down his loan. He's already got a spreadsheet with 3 more potential deals bookmarked, even though he hasn't closed on the first one yet. Rachel wants none of that. She watched a coworker field a 2 a.m. call about a burst pipe, then spend a weekend evicting a tenant who'd stopped paying and decided her money can grow without her personally being on call for it. She wants her $100,000 working in the background while she does literally anything else with her weekends. So Carlos buys a rental property, Rachel buys index funds, and for the next 20 years, we're going to track every mortgage payment, every rent check, every market swing, and every dollar each of them ends up with, starting from the exact same $100,000 with nothing but a spreadsheet and 2 decades standing between them and the answer. Let's get into it. Carlos spends 3 months running numbers on a spreadsheet before he finds it. A 3-bedroom rental in a decent, unglamorous neighborhood, the kind of street nobody puts on a postcard but where people reliably pay rent on time. It's listed at $326,000. After an inspector flags an aging water heater, Carlos negotiates it down to $320,000 and closes. Because it's an investment property and not his primary home, the bank wants more skin in the game. 25% down instead of the usual 20%, which comes to $80,000. Add closing costs at roughly 3%, another $9,600, and Carlos has spent $89,600 of his $100,000. He keeps the remaining $10,400 as a repair and vacancy reserve, sitting in a high-yield savings account rather than the market. The golden rule of landlording is that you never want to be forced to sell a rental to cover an emergency. His loan comes to $240,000. Investment property mortgages also run hotter than owner-occupied ones. He locks in 7.25% on a 30-year fixed, putting his monthly principal and interest at $1,637. He rents the place out for $2,650 a month. Out of that, $293 goes to property taxes, $175 to landlord insurance, $267 into a maintenance fund at the standard 1% of value rule, and $132 set aside for vacancy, since even good rentals sit empty sometimes. That leaves $1,782 before the mortgage. Subtract his $1,637 payment, and Carlos clears $145 a month in actual cash flow. Not exciting, but positive, and every one of those dollars is being paid by his tenant, not him. Rachel, meanwhile, takes her full $100,000, no down payment required, no closing costs, no inspection, and drops the whole thing into a broad market index fund that same week. No mortgage, no tenant, no 2 a.m. calls. She doesn't add anything else monthly. She just lets it sit and compound. Now here's where this conversation usually gets oversimplified into leverage always wins. It's true that Carlos is controlling a $320,000 asset with only $89,600 of his own money. Real estate lets you do that in a way stocks generally don't. But leverage is a volume knob, not a magic trick. It turns gains up. It also turns losses up by exactly the same amount in the other direction. Keep that in mind because it matters a lot later. Let's jump forward 5 years. Carlos's loan balance has dropped from $240,000 to about $226,500, a modest $13,500 in principal, funded almost entirely by his tenant's rent. His rent has climbed to $3,041 a month as leases renew, while his mortgage payment hasn't moved a cent, so his monthly cash flow has grown to about $373. Assuming the property appreciates in the 3.5% to 4.5% range, it's now worth somewhere between $380,000 and $399,000, putting his equity between $153,500 and $172,000. Add his reserve account, now at roughly $29,400 after 5 years of interest and banked cash flow. And Carlos's total wealth sits somewhere between $183,000 and $202,000. Rachel's $100,000, compounding at a 9% average annual return with zero additions, has grown to about $153,900. So even at the low end of the appreciation range, Carlos is already ahead. Not because he's smarter or worked harder, but because leverage means his gains are calculated on $320,000 of asset instead of $100,000 of cash. But before this turns into a leverage victory lap, let's look at what the same mechanism does in reverse. Imagine that right around year 2, a housing correction hits and the property's value drops 12% instead of rising. By that point, Carlos's loan balance is down to about $235,000. Under normal 4% appreciation, his 2-year equity would be about $111,000. Under a 12% correction, it falls to roughly $46,000, a 58% collapse in his equity from a 12% drop in the underlying asset. That's leverage running in reverse, and it's not hypothetical. It's close to exactly what happened to millions of leveraged homeowners in 2008, when double-digit price drops wiped out entire down payments and left people owing more than their homes were worth. Rachel, by contrast, would simply be down 12% on her $100,000. No faster, no slower, dollar for dollar. Leverage is the entire reason Carlos can pull ahead early, and it's the exact same reason he could just as easily fall behind. Let's jump to year 10, assuming the market behaves and keeps appreciating. Carlos's loan balance has fallen to about $207,000, with over $32,800 in principal paid down. His monthly cash flow has grown to $737 as 10 years of rent increases outpace his frozen mortgage payment. His property, still appreciating in that 3.5% to 4.5% band, is worth somewhere between $451,000 and $497,000, putting his equity between $244,000 and $290,000. His reserve account, fed by a decade of banked cash flow, has grown to roughly $75,300. Added up, and Carlos's total wealth lands somewhere between $320,000 and $365,000. Rachel's portfolio, still just compounding untouched, has grown to about $236,700. Push 5 more years to year 15. Carlos's loan balance has fallen to about $179,350. He's now paid down over $60,600 in principal. His monthly cash flow has grown to $1,165 as 15 years of rent increases keep outpacing a mortgage payment that's stayed frozen since day one. His property is worth somewhere between $536,000 and $619,000, putting his equity between $357,000 and $440,000. His reserve, swollen by a decade and a half of banked cash flow, has grown to roughly $158,100. Added up, and Carlos's total wealth sits somewhere between $515,000 and $598,000. Rachel's portfolio, still compounding on autopilot, has grown to about $364,200. Now, year 20. Carlos and Rachel are both 52. Carlos's loan balance has dropped to about $139,500. He's paid down over $100,500 in principal, almost all of it funded by 2 decades of rent checks that were never his own money to begin with. His monthly cash flow has climbed to $1,669. His property is worth somewhere between $637,000 and $772,000, putting his equity between $497,000 and $632,000. His reserve account, after 20 years of compounding and banked cash flow, sits around $291,000. Altogether, Carlos's total wealth lands somewhere between $788,000 and $923,000. Call it roughly 8.5 times his original $100,000. Rachel's portfolio has grown to about $560,000, a very respectable 5.6 times her original $100,000, achieved with zero maintenance calls, zero tenants, and the ability to sell any fraction of it by Tuesday if she ever needed to. So after 20 years, in this particular scenario, Carlos comes out meaningfully ahead. Not by a little, but by several $100,000. That's the honest result of leverage, tenant-funded debt paydown, and 2 decades of compounding cash flow, all working in the same direction at once. But that outcome leaned on a lot of things going right for 20 straight years. Steady 3.5 to 4.5% appreciation with no prolonged crash, rent that kept rising, a tenant who mostly paid on time, no six-figure surprise like a collapsed foundation or a full roof replacement eating into that reserve, and a landlord, Carlos, who was actually willing to answer the phone. Rachel's 5.6 times came from doing precisely nothing after the initial purchase. Carlos's 8.5 times came from being exposed to a lot more risk for a lot more years and having it work out. That's really the trade being made here. Carlos took on debt, illiquidity, and concentration in one property in one neighborhood, exposed to that specific local job market, that specific school district, and whatever the city council decides to do with zoning next. Rachel's diversification means no single company, industry, or city can meaningfully sink her. Carlos's entire real estate net worth depends on one roof in one place. Being a landlord also costs actual hours, screening tenants, coordinating repairs, occasionally driving over at 9 p.m. because a lock jammed. None of that shows up in the spreadsheet, but it's real time Carlos isn't getting back. Time Rachel is spending however she wants. In exchange, Carlos gets leverage that can meaningfully outrun the stock market when things go well. Rachel gave up that leverage boost for full liquidity, zero debt, total diversification, and never once having to think about her money outside of checking an app. If Carlos needs $20,000 fast, his options are a HELOC, a refinance, or selling the house, each one with paperwork, appraisals, and weeks of waiting. If Rachel needs $20,000, she sells shares and has it by Thursday. There's also the cost of changing your mind. If Carlos decided today he wanted out, selling a rental typically runs 7% to 8% between agent commissions and closing costs. On his year 20 numbers, that's roughly $49,000 to $56,000 gone before he sees a dollar of it. If Rachel decided today she wanted out, she'd pay a brokerage a few dollars in trading fees and have cash in her account within days. One quick gut check for evaluating a rental before you buy it is the cap rate, annual income before the mortgage divided by the purchase price. For Carlos's property, that's about $21,400 a year divided by $320,000, a cap rate of roughly 6.7%. Generally, anything north of 6% is considered a reasonably solid deal in most markets. Well below that, and you're often betting almost entirely on appreciation rather than the income the property itself produces. It's a rough screening tool, not a guarantee. It says nothing about what happens to that income if the neighborhood shifts or a recession pushes vacancies up. There's one more piece of the math that hasn't come up yet: taxes. The IRS lets Carlos depreciate the building portion of his property over 27.5 years, which can shelter a meaningful chunk of his rental income even while the property is appreciating in the real world. Rachel's dividends and any gains she eventually realizes get taxed too, just under different rules. It's a genuine advantage for Carlos, though not one this comparison is built to fully price in. Talk to a tax professional before leaning on it too heavily. There's also a version of this that splits the difference. Real estate investment trusts, or REITs, let you buy into large portfolios of income-producing properties through the stock market. You get real estate exposure without ever touching a leaking faucet, just usually without Carlos's kind of leverage or the tenant-funded paydown that made his final number so large. Some investors go the opposite direction instead, house hacking a duplex by living in one unit and renting out the other, which softens the landlord workload while still getting leverage on the deal. There's a whole spectrum between never touch a toilet and own 5 rentals by 40. Most people land somewhere in the middle. It really comes down to 2 honest questions. Are you actually willing to be a landlord, the maintenance calls, the vacancies, the occasional tenant who stops paying, or does that sound like a second job you never signed up for? And can you stomach owing $240,000 on an asset that might be worth less than that for a stretch of years without panic selling at the worst possible moment? If the answer to both is yes, leverage can make real estate a genuinely powerful wealth building tool. If either answer is no, There's nothing wrong with being Rachel. 5.6 times on a completely hands-off $100,000 is not a consolation prize, and plenty of people who forced themselves into landlording because the math looked better on paper have regretted it by the second problem tenant. Neither Carlos nor Rachel made a mistake here. Carlos took on real, measurable risk and, in this particular scenario, got paid for carrying it. Rachel avoided that risk entirely and still multiplied her money more than fivefold without lifting a finger after the initial transfer. The spreadsheet says Carlos wins this version of the story. A slightly worse decade for housing, a bad tenant, or one too many surprise repairs, and the spreadsheet says something completely different. 20 years from now, the real difference between them won't just be a final number. It'll be everything that number cost each of them to get there. If you found this useful, subscribe for more videos like this one. And let me know in the comments, are you buying a rental, buying index funds, or still trying to figure out how to convince a bank to lend you money for both?